There were 300 people inside the Blackstone Crown ballroom that night, and almost every single one of them was worth more than $100 million, except her. By the end of the evening, she would be the only one anyone remembered. But she didn't know that yet. Right now, she was just Sophia Bennett, 24 years old, standing in a coat closet in the basement of the fanciest hotel in Back Bay, pinning a name tag onto a borrowed uniform 2 sizes too big, and whispering a promise to herself she'd whispered 100 times before. Smile, keep your head down, get through the night, rent's due Friday. Above her head, up the service stairs, an empire was throwing itself a party, and she had exactly 6 hours to earn enough tips to make the difference between okay and not. She'd almost not come at all. That morning, before the sun was properly up, an envelope had come through the mail slot of the second-floor apartment above the laundromat in South Boston, and Sophia had known what it was before she picked it up, because the medical billing company used the same cream-colored paper every time, as if softening the envelope might soften the number inside. It didn't. She'd stood in the cold kitchen in her grandmother's old cardigan and read it twice, and then she'd folded it small and put it in the drawer with the others, and she'd gone in to check on Maeve. Her grandmother had been awake, propped against the pillows, watching the grey light come up over the rooftops. Since the second stroke, Maeve's words came slow and crooked, and some mornings they didn't come at all, but her eyes had always worked fine, and they'd found Sophia's face and read the whole thing off it in a second, the envelope, the number, the tired. Don't, Maeve had managed. It took her a long moment to build the rest. Don't you carry it in your face tonight. They can smell it on you, love. I'm tired. A breath. You go in there like you own the place. Sophia had laughed because the idea of her owning any part of the world those people lived in was a joke, and because if she hadn't laughed, she might have cried, and there wasn't time for that. She'd kissed her grandmother's forehead. I'll bring you the fancy little desserts, she'd said, the ones the size of a thumbnail that cost $40. Bring me 2, Maeve had said, and closed her eyes, satisfied. That was Sophia. That was the whole of her, if you wanted to know before the night taught it to 300 strangers. She had been raised since she was a small child by that woman, in that apartment, 3 miles and 1 whole universe away from the ballroom she was about to walk into. Maeve had scrubbed floors in houses exactly like the ones these Gala people owned for 30 years, and had come home every single night without a drop of bitterness in her, which Sophia had always thought was the most impossible strength she'd ever seen. Maeve had one rule, and she'd pressed it into her granddaughter like initials into wet cement, over and over, until Sophia could say it in her sleep. You can't control what a room thinks of you. You can only control whether you leave it with your dignity. Never trade that. It's the one thing they can't buy off you, love. So no. Sophia didn't resent them. That was the thing about her that nobody in that ballroom would understand until it was far too late. She looked at all that wealth the way you look at weather. Something that happened to other people in other places, that had nothing to do with whether you were a good person or not. She genuinely, honestly didn't resent a single one of them. She came up the service stairs, carrying a tray of champagne, and for 1 second, just one, she let herself look. The 17 crystal chandeliers, each one the size of a car. The string quartet in the corner, a woman in emerald silk laughing at something that almost certainly wasn't funny. A man checking a watch worth more than the car Maeve had driven for 19 years. Gowns that had cost more than Sophia's rent for an entire year, worn once, and probably never again. It was beautiful. She'd give them that. It just wasn't hers, and she'd made a kind of peace with that a long time ago. The gala was for Valenti Global Holdings, though almost nobody in the room could have told you what Valenti actually did, only that it was enormous, and that being invited meant you mattered. If you live in Boston, you have touched something that a company owns without ever once knowing it. The glass towers going up along the waterfront, Half the shipping containers stacked in the harbour at dawn, the building your dentist rents, the parking garage you curse on your way to work. Valenti owned it quietly, the way real money always owns things, without a name on the front door. And once a year, the people who moved that money put on their best and gathered under the chandeliers to congratulate each other for being exactly who they already were. There was one man Sophia noticed, though, and she couldn't have told you why. He sat at the head table near the quartet, and he was alone in a way that had nothing to do with the empty chairs around him. Everyone else in that room was performing, laughing a beat too loud, angling their good side toward whoever mattered, working the space like a job. He wasn't. He was watching the room instead of working it, still as deep water, and the stillness of him pulled at her eye, the way the one quiet person at a party always does. People kept drifting toward his table, and then, at the last second, thinking better of it, the way you approach a dog nobody has introduced you to. She watched a United States senator. She recognized him from the news, bend down to say something in the man's ear, and then wait. Actually, wait. Stand there patiently, hands folded for a reply, like someone who had learned the hard way not to rush him. Sophia didn't know his name. For half a second his eyes lifted off the crowd and found hers across 40 feet of chandelier light and held, not sliding over her the way the other's eyes did, not landing on the tray and the uniform and moving on, but landing on her. Then a guest lifted an empty glass in her direction, and the spell broke, and she moved off to do her job and forgot about him. She wouldn't forget about him for long. Around the first hour, a floor captain pressed a pitcher of ice water into her hands and pointed her at the head table. And that was how Sophia ended up standing beside the man she'd noticed. Up close, he was younger than she'd guessed from across the room. Late 30s, maybe. And tired in a way that money doesn't fix, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes and doesn't sleep off. She filled his glass. He watched her do it, and it wasn't the way the others watched her, like she was a piece of the furniture that had learned to walk. It was like she was the only real thing in a room full of very expensive props. "Long night," he said. It wasn't a question. "They usually are." She smiled, because that was the job, and because something about the low steadiness of his voice made it easy. "Can I get you anything else?" "No." He turned the glass a quarter turn on the white cloth, watching the water settle. "You're the first person all night who's looked me in the eye." She didn't know what to do with that. So she said the true thing, which was a habit her grandmother had never managed to break her of. "Everybody's the same height when they're thirsty, sir." Something moved across his face then. Surprise, maybe. Or the ghost of a laugh he hadn't taken out and used in a long, long while. For just a moment the tiredness went out of his eyes, and something else came into them, something that looked almost like relief, as though he'd been waiting all night, or longer than all night, for a person who didn't want anything from him. She moved on to the next table and didn't give it another thought. He gave it thought for the rest of his life. His name was Luca Moretti, and he had come to that gala the way a man goes to a room he owns, out of obligation, not pleasure. He had spent the evening watching 300 people he could ruin, with a phone call pretend to be his equals, and he had been thinking, dully, that he could not remember the last time anyone had spoken to him without doing arithmetic behind their eyes, calculating what he could do for them or to them. And then a waitress had refilled his water and told him that everybody's the same height when they're thirsty, and had walked away without waiting to see whether the line had landed, without angling for anything, without even knowing who he was. It had gone into him like a splinter goes into a hand you didn't know was numb, small, and impossible to stop feeling. He watched her work the room after that. He couldn't have told you he was doing it. He watched the way she crouched to eye level to hear an elderly guest who'd lost his hearing, the way she palmed a dropped napkin off the floor without making the woman who'd dropped it feel clumsy, the way she laughed, a real laugh, quick and surprised at something a busboy whispered to her by the kitchen doors. In a ballroom engineered down to the thread count to be about status, she was the one person operating on some other, older currency entirely, and Luca Moretti, who had spent 20 years and buried more than he'd ever admit to becoming the most powerful man in that city, found that he could not look away from a girl carrying champagne, which is why he saw the whole thing start. The men at table 9 started in on her around the second hour. 4 of them, all somewhere in their 30s, all drunk in that particular way rich men get drunk. Loud, certain, sure the entire room was an audience the universe had assembled for their benefit. The one running his mouth was named Preston Vale. You've met Preston, private equity. A jaw he was extremely proud of. The kind of man who introduces himself by the firm he works for because he isn't sure he's interesting on his own. What Preston kept buried, the secret he had spent a small fortune and 15 years erasing, was that he had not started at the top either. He'd come from a town in Ohio, from a family with nothing, and he had rebuilt himself with a good haircut and a set of teeth and an accent he had practiced in the mirror until the old one, the one that gave him away, was gone. Which is precisely why, when Sophia leaned in to refill his glass and he heard it, that soft, flat South Boston vowel in the way she said, "There you go," something ugly lit up behind his eyes. He knew that sound. It was the sound of where he had come from, the sound he'd spent everything he had to bury, and hearing it come out of a waitress in a borrowed uniform did something to him that he was too drunk and too small to examine. So instead, he did what men like Preston Vale always do with the parts of themselves they hate. He went looking for it in someone weaker so he could punish it there. "Say that again," he said, smiling. "Say park the car." His friends laughed before they even understood why. Sophia gave him the professional smile, the one that cost her nothing. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" "No, I want the accent. Come on, sweetheart, do the accent, it's charming." He turned to his table, spreading his hands like a man introducing an act. It's like a nature documentary. The wild Southie waitress in her natural habitat. Do they teach you to talk like that, or does it just come out? More laughter, louder now, and a few heads at the neighboring tables turning to see what was funny. Here is what Sophia did. She topped off his glass, set the bottle down, said, "You're all set," and started to walk away. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't, because Preston Vale could not stand being walked away from, not by anyone, and least of all, by a girl who reminded him of himself. "Hey! Hey!" He snapped his fingers at her back, twice, sharp, the way you'd call a dog. "Did I say you could go?" The whole table was watching now, and so were the 2 tables beside it, and a woman in emerald silk had gone very still with her fork halfway to her mouth. This is the part nobody likes to admit about rooms like that. The cruelty draws a crowd. People do not stop it. They lean in half an inch, and they arrange their faces into something that isn't quite a smile and isn't quite disapproving. And they tell themselves later that they weren't really part of it, that they were only there, that watching isn't the same as doing. Preston felt the crowd gathering, felt the attention swing his way, and it fed him. He reached into his jacket and drew out a money clip, thick with hundreds. He peeled off 1 bill, then a second, then a third, and he dropped them on the marble floor at her feet. "There," he said, sitting back, "that's more than you'll make all week, isn't it? Go on, pick it up. Let's all watch the little Cinderella dance for it." The quartet kept playing. A champagne flute clinked somewhere near the windows, and for one long, terrible second, nobody in that entire ballroom moved. Everyone at that table expected one of 2 things. They expected her to cry, or they expected her to drop to her knees and scrape the money off the floor with her cheeks burning, because $18 an hour and a grandmother's medical bills do not leave a person much room for pride, and they knew it, and that was the whole point of the exercise. to make her choose the money over her dignity in front of everyone, to prove that everyone has a price and hers was low. Sophia did neither. She looked down at the $300 bills lying on the marble. $900. And she let herself feel, for exactly one honest second, what $900 actually was in her life this month. It was the electric bill, it was the copay, it was the cream-colored envelope in the kitchen drawer made a little less heavy. It was room to breathe that she hadn't felt in a very long time, lying right there on the floor. And all she had to do to take it was become for one moment the thing he wanted her to be. And then she heard her grandmother's voice, clear as if Maeve was standing beside her. "The one thing they can't buy off you." Sophia crouched down, slow and calm, and she picked up the 3 bills. Preston's smirk widened. His friends started to laugh, already tasting it. And then, in front of the whole silent watching room, she folded the bills once, neatly, and set them on the table beside his glass. And she straightened up, and she said, in the exact same warm and level voice she had used on him all night, "You dropped these, sir. I'd hate for you to lose track of your money." A small pause. "Seems like it's all you've got." The laughter died in Preston Vale's throat like a match in the rain. The woman in emerald silk let out a single, involuntary, "Oh." Somebody near the bar made a sound that was almost a laugh and swallowed it. Preston's face went a color that does not have a name, a deep and blotching red that started at his collar and climbed, and what came out of his mouth then was mean and small and loud, loud enough now that half the ballroom had turned to look, loud enough that the quartet faltered. "You know what? You're done. You're fired." He was on his feet, pointing at her, and the pointing finger shook. "I want her out of this building tonight. Do you hear me? I will call whoever runs this catering circus, and I will personally make sure a girl like you never works a room like this again in her entire life." And that was the moment a single chair scraped back against the marble at the head table at the very front of the room, near the string quartet. One chair, and a man stood up. Sophia still didn't know who he was. Almost nobody in that room truly did. That was, in the end, the entire point of a man like Luca Moretti. But everybody felt it. The way a room changes temperature a half-second before your mind understands why. He came around the head table and moved through the ballroom the way water moves downhill, unhurried, certain, as if the floor had been waiting all its life for his feet. And the strangest thing happened as he crossed it. The important people went quiet. The senator went quiet. The developer who owned 4 square blocks of the seaport went quiet. A congresswoman set down her drink. The hush spread out from him in a widening ring, and by the time he reached table 9, you could hear the ice settling in a bucket 40 feet away. 2 of the men at Preston's table had stopped laughing without deciding to. Some instinct older than money had told them what their brains had not yet caught up to, that the most dangerous person in the building had just risen to his feet, and he was walking, without any particular hurry, straight toward them. He stopped beside Sophia. He didn't look at her. He looked at Preston Vale, and when he spoke, his voice was almost gentle. That was the frightening part, how gentle it was. "I heard," Luca said, "that you'd like to speak to whoever runs this." Preston, to his eternal misfortune, was drunk and cornered and used to winning, so he did the thing men like him always do when they should stay quiet. He doubled down. "Yeah, actually I do. This person insulted a paying guest, and I want her gone. Are you the manager, the catering director? Great, wonderful, handle it." Luca let the silence stretch. 1 beat, 2. "No," he said, "I'm not the manager." He reached into his jacket, slowly, and Sophia watched Preston flinch, some animal part of him understanding before the rest of him did, and drew out a slim black card and set it face up on the white tablecloth beside the folded hundreds. There was one word printed on it: Valenti. "My name is Luca Moretti," he said. "I own this company. I own this gala. I own the building we are standing in, the ground it is built on, and, as of a deal that closed on Tuesday, the note on the fund that pays your salary, Mr. Vale. Yes. I know exactly who you are. I make it my business to know every single person I let into my house." He reached down and picked up the $300 bills that Sophia had folded so neatly, and he held them up between two fingers, and he looked at them the way you'd look at something you'd found on the bottom of your shoe. "And in my house," he said, "nobody throws money on the floor and calls it generosity. Nobody snaps their fingers at a woman who has shown more class in the last 5 minutes than every man at this table has managed in his entire life." He set the bills back down. "You wanted her fired. Let me make sure you understand something before you leave. She is the only person in this room tonight that I would trust to hand me a glass of water. Here is the thing people always get wrong about real power. It doesn't shout. Luca Moretti never once raised his voice. He didn't need to, because the second that name landed, Moretti, the entire architecture of that ballroom silently rearranged itself. If you knew Boston, you knew the name. The North End, 3 generations back. A family that had built something in the shadows, in the years when the neighborhood ran on its own laws, and had then done the thing almost no family like that ever manages. Walked it, patiently, across decades, up out of the dark and into the daylight, until the men who used to fear the Morettis were the men now begging them for meetings. Luca was the one who had finished the climb. And there were still stories, told quietly, about the people who had bet against that name and lost, men who had been rich and untouchable on a Friday and simply, permanently unreachable by Monday. And every person of consequence in that ballroom had heard at least one of those stories. Every deal Preston Vale had ever touched, every rung he was clinging to, the introductions he needed, the capital his fund was forever chasing, the entire gleaming future he had built out of a haircut and a fake accent, all of it ran, somewhere upstream, through the man now standing quietly at table 9. You could watch it hit him. It moved across Preston's face like weather coming in off the water. The smirk went first, then the color. Then, last of all, that lifelong load-bearing certainty that he was one of the winners of the world. And without it, for one naked instant, you could see the scared kid from the nowhere town in Ohio underneath, the one who had spent everything he had pretending to be something he wasn't, staring out through a rich man's eyes. "Mr. Moretti," Preston started, and his voice had gone thin. That was a joke. It was the champagne. I would never—" "I know what it was," Luca said. "That's the problem. And this is where the story is supposed to end, isn't it? The cruel man ruined, the powerful man's fist coming down. Justice, clean and cold and total, exactly the way we all secretly want it. Except that is not what happened. Because the person who spoke next was not Luca Moretti, it was Sophia. She put her hand on his arm, on the arm of this stranger. This man the entire room had gone silent with fear of. And she said quietly, just for him, "Don't." Luca turned and looked at her, really looked, the way he had at the head table an hour before, except now 300 people were watching him do it. And Sophia looked back and said, "If you take everything from him, then you and him aren't any different. You just have a bigger table." She glanced at Preston, frozen and uncomprehending. "He already showed everyone in this room exactly who he is. You don't have to do a single thing. That was the punishment. They all saw it." For a moment, Luca Moretti, a man who had not been told don't by another living soul in 15 years, simply stared at her, and something in his face broke open. Because here is what Sophia could not have known. Almost 30 years earlier, when Luca was a boy of 9, a woman used to work galas exactly like this one. She wore a borrowed uniform 2 sizes too big and carried trays of other people's champagne up service stairs on the coldest nights of the winter. And she smiled the professional smile that cost her everything. And she came home to a cramped walk-up in the North End with her feet swollen and her back ruined, and never once, not one single time, let her son see her cry about it. That woman was his mother. And Luca had spent the whole of his childhood watching men exactly like Preston Vale snap their fingers at her and laugh at her accent and look straight through her as though she were a coat rack that had learned to pour wine. She had died the winter before everything he touched began turning to money. That was the part he never said out loud to anyone, the splinter he'd carried for 20 years, that all of it, the empire, the fear, the name that silenced senators, had arrived just a little too late to buy her a single easy day. He had built the whole thing in some deep and wordless place he didn't examine, so that no one would ever again be able to look through a Moretti the way they'd looked through her. And somewhere in all that building, in all that fear he had so carefully manufactured, he had let himself forget the one thing she had actually been trying to teach him, back when he was small and poor and hers, that the money was never the point, that the money was, in fact, the very least of it, that the whole of a person was in how they treated the ones who couldn't do anything for them. And then he had walked into his own gala, tired down to the bone of being feared, and found the only person in 300 who still knew it. A girl from South Boston handing a rich man back his own cruelty, folded neatly with a smile. And then, when the most powerful man in the city offered to burn that cruel man to the ground for her, asking him, "Please, don't." Not because she was weak, because she was good, and she wanted him to be good too. Luca turned back to Preston Vale one last time. "She's asking me to let you keep your career," he said, "so I'm going to, not for you, because she is a better person than a man like you deserves to have met tonight, and I am not going to hand you the gift of turning her into a reason you got ruined. You'll keep your job, you'll keep your seat at whatever table will still have you." He buttoned his jacket. "But you are going to remember her. Every deal you ever close, every room you ever walk into feeling like the biggest man in it. I want you to remember that the smallest, poorest person in this entire ballroom had you outclassed from the moment you opened your mouth, and she still chose to be kind to you. Live the rest of your life with that." Then he did the thing that made the whole room gasp louder than anything else that had happened all night. He picked up her tray, the owner of everything, the man whose name had just gone through 300 people like a cold wind. He took the champagne tray gently out of Sophia's hands, passed it to a stunned busboy walking past, and offered her his arm. "It's freezing out," he said, and for the first time all evening that gentle voice actually was gentle, with nothing underneath it but the thing it sounded like. "Let me get you a car. You've had a long shift." Sophia looked at the offered arm. Then in the room, 300 of the most powerful people in New England, every single one of them watching, not one of them breathing. And then this waitress from South Boston with $900 she had refused, while still sitting folded on the table, lifted her chin the way her grandmother had taught her, and took his arm like a queen who had merely been waiting all her life for someone to finally notice she was one. They walked out together through a silence so complete you could hear her borrowed shoes on the marble the whole long way to the door. The cold hit them like a wall when the doorman pushed the brass doors open. Boston in the deep of winter, the wind coming off the harbor with knives in it, the sidewalk glittering with frost under the streetlights. A black car was already sliding to the curb. Of course it was. Things arrived for men like him before they were asked for. And Luca opened the door himself, which the driver clearly did not expect, and stood there holding it. Sophia didn't get in right away. She stood on the frozen sidewalk in her thin uniform, hugging herself against the cold, and looked at him, And for the first time all night, the professional smile was gone, and there was just a young woman with a great deal on her plate trying to make sense of a night that had gone somewhere she had no map for. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. You made an enemy of every one of those men in there. For a waitress, you don't know." She studied him. "That was expensive, and you don't strike me as a man who wastes money." Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "It wasn't for you," he admitted. "Not only. It was for somebody I used to know. You reminded me of her." He looked out at the harbor, at the black water and the lights of the ships that were, though Sophia didn't know it, mostly his. "I spent a long time forgetting her. You unforgot her. In about 4 seconds with a water pitcher. I owe you the tray." And then, because he was who he was, and because the thing his life had taught him best was that everything soft is also a thing that can be used against you. His face changed, and he said the harder thing, the true and ugly thing, in a low voice, looking at her directly so she couldn't miss it. "You should know what you took an arm from in there. I'm not a nice man, Sophia. The room told you that, even if they were too polite to say the words. The name you were standing next to is a name that people have died being on the wrong side of. Some of them deserved it, not all of them." He let that sit in the cold air between them. "So take the car, get warm, go home to whoever it is you were thinking about when you looked at that money on the floor and didn't take it. And after tonight, if you're smart, and you are, I can see that you are, you'll want nothing to do with me. That would be the sensible thing. I'm telling you the sensible thing because I don't think anyone in your life has ever had a reason to lie to you, and I'd rather not be the first." Sophia looked at him for a long moment. Then she got into the warm car, but before he could close the door, she leaned toward the gap and said plainly, the way she said everything, "My grandmother used to clean houses for people like the ones in that room. 30 years. She always said the ones who told you up front exactly how dangerous they were usually turned out to be the ones you didn't have to watch." A small, tired, real smile. "It's the ones who insist they're harmless. Those are the ones that get you." She let that land. Then, "Thank you for the tray, Mr. Moretti, and for the arm. Good night." He closed the door, and the car pulled away into the frozen city, and Luca Moretti stood alone on the sidewalk in the wind long after its taillights were gone, feeling something he had not felt in more years than he wanted to count, and not entirely sure he liked it because he already knew, with the same instinct that had kept him alive for 2 decades, that it was going to cost somebody something, and that in his life it was never, ever him who paid. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Though not the version anyone would have expected, somebody had filmed it on a phone, the way somebody always does now, and by noon, half of Boston had watched a private equity man in a $5,000 tuxedo throw cash at a waitress and get quietly, surgically dismantled by the most powerful person in the city. A man almost none of them had ever seen speak in public, ever, about anything. The clip was 40 seconds long. It had no sound but the room's gasp, and people could not stop watching it. By the evening, it had a name on the internet, the Tray Guy, and by the end of the week, Preston Vale had a nickname that would follow him into every conference room he ever walked into for the rest of his career, because it turned out the single cheapest thing he did that whole night was the $900. Sophia had gone home to the apartment above the laundromat in that black car, and had let herself in quietly so as not to wake her grandmother, and had found Maeve wide awake anyway, propped against the pillows in the dark, waiting up like she used to when Sophia was 16 and out too late. So Sophia had sat on the edge of the bed and told her the whole thing, start to finish, and Maeve, who could barely shape a full sentence anymore since the second stroke, had laughed until she cried, and gripped her granddaughter's hand with a strength that surprised them both, and gotten out 4 slow, crooked, perfectly clear words. "Told you. Dignity." And that should have been the end of it. A good story to tell for years. The night the richest man in Boston carried a Southie girl's tray. Except that the same clip that made Sophia a folk hero for a week did something else, in rooms Sophia had never been in and never would be. It showed the whole of Luca Moretti's world, that the man they feared had, in front of 300 witnesses, a soft place. And in his world, a soft place is not called a soft place. It is called a weakness, and weakness is called leverage, and leverage is called opportunity. And there were men who had been waiting a very long time for Luca Moretti to give them one. The one who moved first was named Cormac Doyle. If the Morettis were the North End, Italian, 3 generations deep, risen up into the daylight, then Doyle was the other Boston, the one Sophia had actually come from. South Boston. The Irish end of the city's old dark arithmetic, the rackets that ran under the surface of the neighborhood she'd grown up in. The reason Maeve had always told her which 3 corners never to walk past after dark. For 30 years, there had been a cold, careful peace between the North End and Southie, the way there is peace between 2 dogs who have each decided the other one is too much trouble to bite. Doyle had inherited his end of that peace from harder men, and he had spent a decade resenting it, because peace is bad for a man whose whole worth is measured in fear, and Cormac Doyle could feel his own fading. And then he watched a 40-second video of Luca Moretti pick up a waitress's tray, and he laughed, and he understood at once that the peace was over, because Moretti had just told the entire world the one thing a man in their line of work must never let anyone know. That there was, at last, something he was not willing to lose. It did not take Doyle's people long to find out who the girl was. That was the terrible, ordinary part. Sophia was not hidden. She was a name on a catering roster, a face on a viral clip, a granddaughter at a known address above a laundromat on a street where Doyle's men had collected debts for years. She was, in the cruelest possible irony, easiest of all to reach precisely because she came from the neighborhood that the danger came from too. The threat, when it came for the woman Luca Moretti had decided to protect, was going to come wearing the accent of her own home. Luca knew all of it within a day, because knowing things was what he did, and it put him in front of a choice he'd spent his whole careful life arranging never to have to make. He was standing at the window of an office 30 floors above the harbor when his oldest man told him. Salvatore had been at his father's side before Luca was born. He had a face like a closed door, and had never once in 40 years told Luca a comfortable lie, which was exactly why Luca kept him close. "You know what the smart thing is," Sal said. He didn't make it a question either. "The smart thing is, you never see the girl again." It was a nice moment. The city loved it. Now it's over. You go dark on her completely, and there's nothing there for Doyle to hold on to, because a man's got no weakness in a woman he's not connected to. You walk away and she stays safe and bored and alive, and this whole thing dies in a week like everything on the internet dies in a week. He paused. "That's the smart thing, Luca. I'd be failing your father if I told you anything else." Luca watched the ships move on the black water. His ships. "And the other thing?" "There's no other thing that ends well. You know that. You've buried enough people to know exactly how the other thing ends." Sal's voice was not unkind. That was the worst part of it. "The kindest thing you can do for that girl is let her go back to being nobody. Kindness, in this life, mostly looks like distance. And here is where it would have been easy, where a lesser man, a colder man, the man Luca had spent 20 years training himself to be, would have simply done the smart thing, because the smart thing was genuinely, coldly correct, and would genuinely, coldly have kept her safe. Luca knew it was correct. He turned it over in his mind for the rest of the day, standing at that window, and every way he looked at it, Sal was right. The way to protect Sophia Bennett was to become, to her, exactly what everyone in that ballroom had been to his mother. A person who looked straight through her and moved on. The way to keep her alive was to treat her like she didn't matter. He could not do it. Not because he was noble. He'd let go of thinking of himself as noble a long time ago, somewhere over the years and the graves. He couldn't do it because he had spent his whole life around people who wanted things from him, and she was the first one in, as long as he could remember, who had wanted nothing, and the thought of purchasing her safety by teaching her that she'd been wrong to look him in the eye, that kindness gets punished, that goodness makes you a target, that the sensible thing is to become small and careful and afraid, was a price he found, to his own surprise, that he was not willing to pay. His mother had died believing the world was better than it had treated her. He was not going to prove her wrong, using a girl who reminded him of her. So he did the thing he was actually good at, which was not the smart thing, and not the kind thing, but the quiet thing, the thing that let him tell himself he wasn't really doing anything at all. He paid the bill. The cream-colored envelope stopped coming to the apartment above the laundromat. When Sophia called the medical billing company, braced for a fight, to ask why they'd sent a statement showing a zero balance, the woman on the phone told her, sounding faintly confused herself, that the entire account, every dollar of Maeve's care, the strokes, the therapy, the years of it, had been paid in full, anonymously. That morning, no name. Sophia stood in the cold kitchen holding the phone for a long time after the woman hung up. She knew exactly who it was. Of course she did. And she was furious. She found him, which was itself a small miracle, and told him something about her, that a Southie waitress had the nerve and the network to run down the most private man in the city, outside a cafe in the North End 2 days later, and she did not thank him. She walked straight up to him on the sidewalk, in the cold, in her work clothes, and she said, "You paid for it." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't." She used his own word from the ballroom back on him, and she saw it land. "You paid my grandmother's medical bills, all of them. Every dollar we've been drowning in for 4 years, gone in one morning from a man with no name." Her eyes were bright and hard. "Do you have any idea what you took from me?" That stopped him, because it was not what he'd expected, and Luca Moretti did not often fail to expect a thing. "I took a debt off you," he said slowly. "I gave you—" "You took the fight," Sophia said. "That fight was mine. Those bills were mine. Every double shift, every night I came home too tired to feel my feet. That was me taking care of the only family I have left with my own 2 hands, the way she took care of me. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and it was the proudest I've ever been, and you erased it in a morning with money you won't even miss, and you didn't ask me. Because it never once occurred to you to ask me, because in your whole life nobody has ever said no to you and meant it." She was crying now, angry tears, and she wiped them off with the back of her hand and did not stop. "You think you gave me a gift. You gave yourself one. You wanted to feel like a good man, and you used my grandmother to do it." There was a long silence on the cold sidewalk. People flowed around them, and Luca Moretti, who silenced senators, who had not apologized to another human being in longer than Sophia had been alive, looked at the ground for a moment, and then looked back up at her and said, in a voice she had not heard from him before, stripped of all its quiet power, almost unsteady, "You're right." It was 2 words. It nearly killed him to say them, and it was the most honest thing anyone in that neighborhood had heard him say in 20 years. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Whatever this is, I know how to protect people. I've only ever known one way. You find the thing that's hurting them and you make it stop with money or with worse, and you don't ask permission because asking permission is a delay, and delays get people killed in my life. That's the only language I have. I reached for the only tool I own." He shook his head slowly. I didn't know the bills were the proud thing. How would I know that? Nobody's ever been proud of a hard thing in front of me. In my world, we're only ever ashamed of them, or hiding them. He almost laughed, and there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of wonder. You are the strangest, most impossible person I have ever met. You'll refuse $900 off a floor and then cry over me paying off the thing that's been crushing you because I did it the wrong way. A breath. Tell me the right way. I'll try. I've never tried before. I don't promise I'll be good at it. And Sophia, because she was, in the end, her grandmother's granddaughter, and because she had watched this man break himself open on a public sidewalk to say 2 words he'd never said, felt the anger go out of her, and something more dangerous come in to take its place. She said, "The right way is you let me carry my own things, and when it's too heavy, you ask, 'Can I help you carry that?' And you wait for the answer, like a person, not like a king." She wiped her face again. "That's the right way. It's not complicated. It's just hard for men who've never had to learn it." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, because he had promised her the truth on the first night and did not intend to be the first person in her life to lie to her, he told her the rest of it. Doyle, the peace that was over, the danger that had come looking not in spite of her neighborhood but through it, the fact that the smart thing was for him to walk away and that he'd already decided he wasn't going to, and that this decision might cost her a great deal and that she deserved to make it herself with all. The facts, the way she deserved to do everything herself. He laid it all out in the cold, and he watched the fear move across her face. Real fear, because she was not stupid, and she understood exactly what he was telling her. And when he was finished, Sophia Bennett stood on a North End sidewalk with the wind cutting through her thin coat, holding the knowledge that loving this man, if that was even the word for the thing that had started with a water pitcher, might put her and everyone she had left in the path of something very old and very dark. And she thought about her grandmother, who had cleaned other people's houses for 30 years and come home without bitterness, who had taught her that you cannot control what a room thinks of you, only whether you leave it with your dignity. Maeve had also taught her something she'd said less often on the harder nights, that you don't get to pick a safe life, only an honest one, and that the people who spend everything staying safe usually find they've spent it on nothing. "Here's what's going to happen," Sophia said finally, and her voice only shook a little. "You are not going to make this choice for me by disappearing, or by paying somebody, or by doing anything at all to me instead of with me. We already covered that." A small, brave, frightened smile. "And I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being careful just because being careful is smart. My grandmother didn't raise a careful girl. She raised a girl who picks the money up off the floor and hands it back." She looked at him steadily. "So, you said you'd ask and wait for the answer. Here's your first real chance. Ask me." Luca Moretti looked at this waitress from South Boston, this impossible, unbuyable, unbending person who had walked into his life carrying champagne and rearranged 20 years of certainty in the space of a week. And for the first time since he was a boy of 9, watching his mother pour other people's wine, he felt something that wasn't fear and wasn't power and wasn't the cold weight of the name he carried. He felt, of all the ridiculous things, hope, which was the most dangerous feeling of all, because hope is the thing that can be taken from you. "Sophia Bennett," he said, "will you let me stand next to you, whatever comes? I can't promise you it'll be safe. I've never been able to promise anyone that, and I won't start by lying to the one person who never lied to me. I can only promise I'll ask before I act, and I'll tell you the truth even when it's ugly, and I'll spend whatever I have to spend. And it's a great deal, and not all of it is money, keeping the world from ever looking through you the way it looked through her." He held out his hand, not his arm this time, just his open hand in the cold like an ordinary man. "May I help you carry it?" And 3 miles and one whole universe from the ballroom where it started, on a frozen North End sidewalk, with the harbour wind in her hair and her grandmother's voice somewhere in the back of her heart, and a great and gathering darkness she could not yet see moving somewhere out past the edge of the streetlights. Sophia looked at the open hand of the most feared man in the city, a man who had just made himself smaller than she had ever seen him for her. And she took it, not because she was weak, because she was good, and she had decided that goodness was worth the risk, the way her grandmother always had. He kept coming back in the days after to the thing she'd said the very first night with the water pitcher, before any of it happened, that everybody's the same height when they're thirsty. He'd spent 20 years and buried more than he'd ever say, making sure that would never be true for him, that no one would ever again be able to look through a Moretti the way they'd looked through his mother. And a girl in a borrowed uniform had said it to him like it was the most obvious fact in the entire world, and then proved she meant it by refusing his money and refusing his rescue and taking his hand anyway. Some men rule empires. Luca Moretti had spent his whole life becoming one of them, and he had just discovered, far too late to save himself from it, that he would trade all of it: the name, the fear, the ships on the black water, every square block of the daylight his family had climbed into, for the right to keep one Southie waitress safe and unbought and looking the world in the eye. He didn't yet know how much that world was about to make him pay for the privilege. But that is a different night, and a different, darker kind of danger. And Cormac Doyle was already awake 3 miles away in the neighborhood they both had claimed to know, smiling in the dark, because he had finally found the thing the untouchable man could not stand to lose. And men like Doyle only ever smile like that right before they reach for it.